Nursing 431, Quantitative Research Designs. First, let's review the course learning objectives. They are apply critical thinking when relating nursing research to practice. 5, differentiate between quantitative and qualitative research. 8, critically analyze research findings. The weekly objectives include recognize the importance of outcomes of research, differentiate between internal and external validity in experimental research, identify threats to internal and external validity, compare qualitative and quantitative research, list the steps of quantitative and qualitative research, and examine the strengths and weaknesses of quantitative and qualitative research methods. Exploratory studies are conducted when there is little known about the phenomena of interest and involves a flexible approach to collecting both qualitative and quantitative data, often without formulating hypotheses. Descriptive studies describe phenomena or the relationship between variables on which enough information is available to formulate a testable hypothesis. Explanatory studies are most rigorous, searching for an explanation for relationships among phenomena through manipulation of variables and the control of research conditions. Experimental research is concerned with cause and effect relationships, manipulating or controlling the independent variable, the cause, and measuring the dependent variable, which is the effect. Due to the difficulty of establishing causal relationships and applying controls on human beings, nursing research studies tend to employ non-experimental designs more often than experimental ones. Internal validity of an experimental design concerns the degree to which changes in the dependent variable can be attributed to the independent variable. Any other factor that influences the dependent variable merits explanation. External validity concerns the degree to which results can be generalized to other people or other settings. A balance must be made between internal and external validity so as not to unnecessarily influence one by emphasizing the other. As control for internal increases, external decreases. As concern for external increases, internal may be affected. There are 6 threats to internal validity: selection bias, history, maturation, testing instrumentation change, and mortality. The threat of selection bias exists when changes in the dependent variable are due to subject differences rather than to experimental treatment and can be avoided through the random assignment of subjects to groups. The threat of history occurs when some event besides the experimental treatment happens during the course of the study, influencing the dependent variable. Researchers attempt to control this bias through random assignment of subjects and the inclusion of simultaneous control group. The threat of maturation happens when changes occur within the subjects during an experimental study, and these changes influence the study results. Use of a comparison group helps to control this threat. The testing threat may occur in studies when a pretest is given or when subjects have knowledge of baseline data influencing their post-test scores. When mechanical instruments or judges are used in pretest and post-test phases of a study, the threat of changes in instrumentation accuracy must be considered. Training of judges and continually checking instrument accuracy reduces this threat. The mortality threat occurs when attrition rate differs between study groups. And while this threat cannot be controlled by any research design, establishing a strong researcher-participant relationship helps participants recognize the importance of their continued involvement. There are 3 major threats to external validity. The first is the Hawthorne effect, the experimental effect, and the reactive effects of the pretest. The Hawthorne effect occurs when study participants respond in a certain manner because they are aware that they are being observed. It may be avoided by using a double-blind experiment. The experimenter effect occurs when subject behaviors in experimental studies are influenced by the researcher characteristics or behaviors, such as facial expressions, clothing, age, gender, and body build. In non-experimental studies, the term Rosenthal effect indicates the influence of an interview on the respondent's answers. The reactive effects of the pretest may occur when subjects have been sensitized to the experimental treatment through taking the pretest or baseline data knowledge. The external validity threat due to the pretest is different from the internal validity threat because it is the indirect rather than the direct cause of the change in the post-test measurements. There are three broad categories of experimental research designs. The first is true experimental, then there's quasi-experimental, and then there's pre-experimental. True experimental designs are those in which the research has a great control over the research situation. Threats to internal validity are minimized, and causality is inferred with some degree of confidence. In order for an experiment design to be considered a true experimental design, the researcher must manipulate the experimental variables. At least one experimental and one comparison group must be included in the study, and the subjects must be randomly assigned to the experimental or the comparison group. The next one, quasi-experimental designs, are those in which there is either no comparison group or subjects are not randomly assigned to groups. While quasi-experimental designs do not allow for as much control as true experimental designs, they do have the advantage of more closely approximating the real world by using naturally occurring groups. The third, pre-experimental designs, are considered weak because the researcher has little control over the research. There are three main experimental designs, which include the pre-test and post-test control group design, the post-test only design, and the Solomon 4 group design. In the most commonly used experimental design, which is the pre-test post-test control group design, subjects are randomly assigned to groups. A pre-test is given to both groups. The experimental group receives the experimental treatment, while the comparison group receives the routine treatment or no treatment. And finally, a post-test is given to both groups. The pre-test post-test control group design has both advantages and disadvantages. While it controls all threats to internal validity, allowing the researcher to statistically adjust post-test scores based on initial differences, the disadvantage is the advantage. The disadvantage is the external threat of the reactive effects of the pretest, meaning results can be generalized only to situations in which a pretest was administered. In the post-test only control group design, the subjects are randomly assigned to groups. The experimental group receives the experimental treatment. The comparison group receives the routine treatment or no treatment, and a post-test is given to both groups. The post-test only control group design is superior to the pre-test post-test control group design because it is easier to carry out and eliminates any threat of the reactive effects of the pretest, allowing for more extensive generalization of the results. In the Solomon 4 group design, subjects are randomly assigned to one of four groups. Two of the groups, experimental group 1 and comparison group 1, are pre-tested. Two of the groups, experimental group 1 and experimental group 2, receive the experimental treatment, while two groups, comparison group 1 and comparison group 2, receive the routine treatment or no treatment, and a post-test is given to all four groups. While the Solomon 4 group design is considered the most prestigious experimental design, minimizing threats to both internal and external validity and allowing the researcher to confidently associate differences between the experimental and the comparison groups with the experimental treatment, it has the disadvantages of requiring a large sample and a very complicated statistical analysis. Examples of quasi-experimental designs are the non-equivalent control group design and the time series design. The non-equivalent control group design is similar to the pre-test post-test control group design, except there is no random assignment of subjects to the experimental and comparison groups. While internal validity is somewhat controlled in the non-equivalent control group design, the selection bias internal validity threat remains. In a time series design, the researcher periodically observes or measures the subjects with experimental treatment being administered between two of the observations. In a time series design, threats to internal validity include history and testing. Examples of pre-experimental designs are the one-shot case study and the one-group pre-test post-test design. The one-shot case study is a very weak design in which a single group is exposed to an experimental treatment and is observed after the treatment, not controlling for any threats to internal validity. The one-group pre-test post-test design provides a comparison between a group of subjects before and after the experimental treatment, not controlling for internal validity threats of history, maturation, testing, or instrumentation change. Non-experimental research is descriptive in nature, with the researcher describing the phenomena as it exists rather than controlling or manipulating the variables. There are several types of non-experimental research, including survey research, correlational research, comparative research, and methodological research. Survey studies are investigations in which self-report data are collected from samples with the purpose of describing populations on some variables of interest. Survey studies have the advantages of being able to provide accurate information on populations using relatively small samples and allowing large amounts of data to be collected quickly with minimum cost. One disadvantage of this method is that self-report data may be unreliable because subjects may provide responses they see as socially acceptable. In correlational studies, the researcher examines the strength of relationships between variables by determining how changes in one variable are associated with changes in another. The strength and direction of the relationship varies, as indicated by a correlation coefficient, and may be positive or negative. Comparative studies examine the differences between intact groups on some dependent variable of interest without manipulation of the independent variable. Comparative studies may be classified as either retrospective if the dependent variable is identified at the present, an attempt is made to determine the independent variable that occurred in the past, or prospective if the independent variable is identified at the present time, then the subjects are followed into the future to observe the dependent variable. While prospective studies have the advantage of being able to employ an experimental approach and manipulate the independent variable, they have the disadvantage of being costly. Methodological studies concerned with development, testing, and evaluation of research instruments and methods are becoming increasingly popular in nursing research. Developing a stockpile of research instruments appropriate to the field. Secondary analysis studies are an efficient and economical type of study excuse me, in which data gathered in the previous studies are analyzed, testing new hypotheses or asking new questions of existing data. Research may be classified Research may be classified as laboratory or field studies according to the setting in which the study is conducted. In laboratory studies, subjects are studied in a specially created environment in which the researcher attempts to control the research environment as much as possible. Field studies are conducted in real-life settings in which not much control can be maintained by the researcher. They are particularly appropriate for the practice discipline of nursing. After reading an entire research report, the quantitative research design should be carefully critiqued to determine whether or not the appropriate design has been used. There are 8 questions that may serve as guidelines in critiquing the design section of quantitative studies. The questions for critique of quantitative studies include: is the design clearly identified and described? Is the design appropriate to test the hypothesis or hypotheses or research questions? If an experimental design was used, was it appropriate? If an experimental design was used, what means were used to control for threats to internal and external validity? Was the assignment of subjects to experimental and control groups clearly described? Does the research design allow the researcher to draw a cause and effect relationship between variables? If a non-experimental design was used, would an experimental design have been more appropriate? If a non-experimental design was used, what means were used to control for extraneous variables?